All right, well, it's 10 after, so it's officially time to get going. This is a sort of a wonderful thing. We only last week hatched these plans together to have these three talks, but I'm Ned Friedman, the director of the Arnold Arboretum, and I'm actually going to turn it right over to Richard Primack, who is a professor at Boston University, and Colleen Hitchcock, who is a professor at Brandeis University, and three of their students who are going to be presenting. And what I want to say is, part of this work has been underwritten by some of our competitively awarded research grants, which we're very happy to have and to be able to get people to work in our collections. And Richard's been working in the Arboretum collections for many a year. I think he's a regular presence. We bump into each other every so often. And I'm just delighted you brought your classes here over the years. And nothing makes me happier because all of Boston, with all of our universities, we probably add up to like 12 botanists. So there's just not a lot of plant people here. So we have to really be collectively engaged. And I'm really glad to have these associations with Brandeis and with BU. So Richard, I'll leave it to you for the next step.
Okay. Thank you. So again, it's a great pleasure to be here. And before I forget again, thanks to the Arnold Arboretum, which provided support for this project and other previous projects of ours at Boston University. I just want to introduce the various people, and then each one will be speaking in turn. So first, Colleen Hitchcock, who's a professor at Brandeis, if you could just raise your hand or stand up. And then Ethan Rosenfeld, who's an undergraduate from Brandeis. Ada Fang, who's an undergraduate at Boston University. And Matteo Finnerty, who's an undergraduate at Boston University. This is a project which really went on for 2 years, and there were actually other undergraduates and other people involved in the project through the years, and some of them will be mentioned in the talk. I also want to point out we also have a professor from Boston University here, John Finnerty, who's a marine biologist, an evo-devo biologist, and he's just very interested in undergraduate activities. Some of you may realize at some point that he has the same last name as Matteo, which is not a coincidence. Sheer coincidence. So it's a great having him here as well. So this is a project which has been going on for 2 years at the Arnold Arboretum on flower visitors to the plants growing at the Arnold Arboretum, primarily the woody plants. Again, this is a collaborative relationship between the Arnold Arboretum, Boston University, and Brandeis University. And this just shows us out in the field, so we're trying to do good science and also have a good time, and also really enjoying the flowers that are out there. Let's see if this works. Okay, so the reason that we undertook this project is that over the last 10 years, there is increasing evidence of widespread insect decline. And insects just are not as abundant as they used to be. And this is coming out both as people's impressions as well as from scientific studies. And so we see less diversity of insects. So when you go to a particular community, there are fewer kinds of insects. And of the insects that are there, they are less abundant. So we are seeing fewer insects out there. And this is a major scientific concern because insects provide great ecosystem services. So insects are pollinators of plants. Many of them control pest insects, and also insects provide food for other animals like birds and mammals. So a decline of insects has very serious implications, not only for the ecology of ecosystems, but also for humans. And so part of the motivation for this study is just simply to see what kinds of insects there are at the Arnold Arboretum and how abundant they are. But there's also a particular concern, which is that in the Boston area and across the United States, across the world, there's increased interest in having pollinator gardens as a way of providing a resource for the insects to give the insects more food. So maybe this will increase insect populations. And also as part of public education, allowing people to see the range of plants and the range of insects that are visiting the plants. So there's a very strong public education component to having pollinator gardens. At the same time, there's also increase in people having honeybee hives. So this is increasing in popularity as a hobby in the Boston area and really throughout the world. So people are thinking that if they have pollinator gardens, that this will help people think that if they have honeybee hives, this will help plants because the honeybees will provide pollination for the plants. Also, people are thinking it's a very good hobby. They are producing honey, so people are very enthusiastic about having honeybees in areas around Boston and really throughout the United States and throughout the world. But it's increasingly the case in the Boston area that these honeybee keepers and pollinator garden people are coming into conflict. And what's happening is that many people who are trying to protect native pollinators, native insects, think that honeybees might be taking food away from the native pollinators and thinking that honeybees, which are not native, which are European, are contributing to the decline of insects by taking pollen and nectar away from the native insects and maybe even transferring disease to the native pollinators. And so in places like Boston, there are these groups that are increasingly coming into conflict with one another. And there's a specific question which is being asked at many town and city meetings in Boston, surprisingly often, which is that would restricting the number of honeybee hives and maybe even banning honeybee hives lead to increases in native pollinators? So often at these town meetings, the pollinator garden people will say that the number of honeybee hives is too many and we should be restricting them. But as a scientist, when I go to these meetings and I hear people talk about it, or I read articles on it, I'm struck by the fact that often the people who are arguing with one another actually don't know what the honeybees are visiting. The honeybee keepers don't know what their bees are feeding on. And the pollinator garden people don't know what the insects are that are visiting their pollinator gardens. So they often are arguing without really knowing what's happening. And this is really what prompted us to do a study 4 years ago in Newton and just documenting what the range of flower visitors were in Newton and to what extent that the different kinds of insects were visiting different plants, cultivated and wild plants in Newton. And so this led in 2024 to our doing a study at the Arnold Arboretum. So this study at the Arnold Arboretum, which began in 2024, asked a few basic questions. So first of all, what insects are visiting particular woody plant species at the Arnold Arboretum? What are the ecological, environmental, and phylogenetic, or one could say evolutionary factors which might affect visitation rates? And also a more general question is, can honeybees and native insects coexist at the Arnold Arboretum and other places? And then potentially, are there any changes over time? Can we see that there's been any decline of insect diversity or insect abundance at the Arnold Arboretum? And the focus of our research, again, is at the Arnold Arboretum. And the reason that we wanted to work at the Arnold Arboretum is because when you actually read the literature of pollination and pollinator communities and pollinator surveys, it's very heavily biased toward herbaceous plants. So people mostly look at plants on the ground where they can access them pretty easily. And so there haven't been large-scale surveys that we've come across where people have looked at the insect visitors to trees, especially trees, but also shrubs, but particularly trees. Another reason for working at the Arnold Arboretum is that botanical gardens have a lot of species. So if you're interested in looking at the diversity of insects on a diversity of plants, botanical gardens are the place to work because they have so many insects at botanical gardens. And then a third reason, which is kind of underappreciated, is that the reason to work at arboretums is because you can access the flowers very readily. The reason that mostly people haven't studied the flowers, the insects visiting the flowers of trees, is because the flowers are mostly high up in most situations. But at an arboretum like the Arnold Arboretum, where the trees are grown spaced out, often the flowers are on not only on the tops of the trees, but also on the sides of the trees. So you can look at the flowers and observe the insects very readily. So it's a great place to work. So now I introduce Colleen Hitchcock, who will tell you what we did.
So I'm just going to walk us through the methods before we turn it over to the students to actually share what the findings were. So essentially, we went out into the field and did a number of surveys that were done on these 5-minute intervals at the woody plants, mainly woody plants, but also other wild plants and some herbaceous species. We started in April and we ended the very end of July. So we did not keep going through August. When we were out documenting, some of the things that we documented are things that you would expect. So the date, the time, the weather conditions, cloud cover, how much wind there was, because we wanted to get a sense of, how much that was impacting whether or not there were insects present at the floral resources. And then what we would do is we recorded some attributes about the plants. So we, classified if they were a tree, shrub, a vine, if they were an ornamental herbaceous plant, an adventive herb in the wildflower meadow, or perhaps in the pollinator garden. And then we classified on the actual plants themselves a rough calculation of what the abundance of flowers were. So low, medium, high. And then finally, we also recorded the accession number so that we could pull up information about the species of plant that we were observing on. So then in terms of looking at the species, so how did we classify species? So we did some rough classifications of the species, which focused on whether or not they were non-native bees, whether they were native bees, and for those native bees, we did classify our bumblebee species. We saw 4 in total, but 3 more commonly. Across the Arboretum, we would classify our carpenter bees, and then for our other native bees, what we would do is we would look at the size. So there were things that were honeybee sized, medium sized, or small sized. And so that little graphic there gives you kind of a sketch of what we bucketed all of our taxa into, is one way to kind of think about it. So we weren't out there trying to key out all of the individual species, but had this broader brush. And then looking at some of our other flower visitors like butterflies, flies, etc. And so putting them into other buckets. The work also connected us with the community, so we did work to some degree with the tree spotters in both summers, so we very much appreciate engaging with them, and they were great for helping us to work through the collections and familiarize ourselves with the collections. In our efforts to connect with the community, we also used 2 types of apps in the field. One of them was Anecdata. So there is a project set up on Anecdata that works through the protocols and follows kind of our paper data sheets, and Ethan can take all of the credit for battling through Anecdata to put that into that question format to make it user-friendly. And the upside to doing Anecdata is, can't move away from the podium, sorry. The upside to doing Anecdata is that you can also put in photos both of the plant that you're observing as well as the insects. So you can have both of those kind of photo shoots embedded into the data sheet collection, so you're not trying to like cross-check everything with your paper data sheet. In addition, we used iNaturalist. iNaturalist was primarily used in order to help us get up to speed with some of our identifications and to verify things later. So things that we didn't know and that were friendly enough to kind of accommodate us with a photo shoot, we would take a photo of and we would record that data. And then there's some potential in the future to maybe look at the iNat data to also look at co-occurrence, to look at insects on floral species. In addition to the study here at the Arnold Arboretum, there's a network of 12 international gardens that were also applying these protocols. There were a handful last summer, and then all 12 of them were with us this summer. And so you can see the team at the Korean National Arboretum there on the bottom left, and then I was lucky enough in the fall to visit Edinburgh and got to connect with our collaborator there and walk around their collections. And then in terms of what we gathered in these 2 seasons, so over the 2 summers, we essentially looked at 600 different plant species per year. We had approximately 1,400 observations per year. When we look across those plants observed, half of them were shrubs, a quarter of them were trees, and another quarter of them were herbaceous things. When we were making our observations focused it on what was being visited, not how effective those visitors were when visiting those flowers. So it's really just about who's on the flower versus how good it was at doing whatever it is on the actual flower. So the other thing that was significant here is that we recorded the behaviors. So we classified it into kind of 3 groups, and hopefully the videos will still play. So this first one, we can see that scramble behavior. We're simply collecting pollen. On this next one, you can see some of that nectaring behavior, so that more purposeful kind of probing into the flower by our wasp. And then in the center video here, you can see a combination of that, right? You can see that those pollen sacs are full, but then we also see this purposeful kind of probing behavior on the part of the bee. Oh, sorry. I didn't realize it was going to do that for us as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ada to transition and talk a little bit about the data.
So as Colleen talked about before, we collect a lot of variables to determine the vegetation rate, and one thing is the temperature. So this figure on the screen, you can see it's a figure about the temperature through the season, and the x-axis is a date, which has a date on it, and on the y-axis, it shows the temperature. You can see like early in the season, like from April, it's about like 40 degrees of Fahrenheit, but later in the season, it increased to like 80 degrees of Fahrenheit. So there's a strong seasonal temperature effect through the season. But we need to notice that early in the season, because the temperature is too cold, there will be the pollinators will not go outside, so we will not collect data at that time. And later in the season, when the temperature raised to like above 85 degrees, because it's too hot for the researchers to do research outside, so we will also not record the data at above that temperatures. And sorry. And these two pie charts shows the overall distribution of the pollinators between 2 years. The one on the left shows the pollinator data of 2024, and on the right it shows the pollinator distribution of 2025. You can see there's the relative abundance of pollinators are changing between 2 years. For the honeybees, it decreased the proportion of it, but for the bumblebees, the proportion of bumblebees increases between years. And the dominant pollinators of 2 years are all bees, like the native bees, the bumblebees, and the honeybees. But besides bees, there are still other pollinators we found in the field. For example, the flies, the butterflies, and the beetles, and some other insects. So we surprisingly find that there's few butterflies in the field. As you can see, the pictures on the left is the photo we took in the field. It's a butterfly, and also we found there's specialized visitors. For example, in the middle of the picture in the middle, it is a carpenter bees. Although it visits various plants, but we find it specifically likes the wisteria plants and also the legume plant. And for the sculpted resin bee, we find it specifically like to visit the golden rain tree. So what factors are important in determining the vegetation rate? Through the linear regression model we conducted, we find the two factors are significant. The first one, the most important one, is the day of the year. We found as the days goes on, the vegetation goes up. And we also find the flower abundance are significant in 2025, which means when there's abundant flowers, there will be a higher vegetation rate. So you can see from this figure, the x-axis shows the date, which is a month, and the bars on it shows the flower abundance level. The green bar shows the scattered flowers, and the orange bar shows the moderate flowers, and the blue bar shows the abundant flowers. And also the y-axis is the vegetation rate. So overall for this graph, you can see that there's an overall increase trend for the vegetation rate as the days goes on. And also, if you look at July, there are twice as much vegetation rate for abundant flowers than that of the moderate or scattered flowers. So this also shows the flower abundance that will also affect the vegetation rate. And we think this is possibly because early in the season, in the spring, there are a lot of plants in flower, and there's only few insects. For example, you can see the picture on the left is the crabapple tree, and it's covered by flowers in spring. But later in the season, like in summer or in July, many flowers become tired, so there are fewer flowers. However, the insect number are increasing, so there will be fewer food resources for the insects to visit, so there will be a higher visitation rate for the pollinators. And you can see the photo on the right. It's a carpenter bees on the honeysuckle in summer. And this graph shows the plant habits and the vegetation rate. The x-axis shows the date, and the blue bars shows the small plant size, which is herbs. The orange bar shows the medium plant size, which is shrub and vines. And the green bars is the large plant size, which is trees. And the y-axis is also the vegetation rate. And you can see, like, especially in July, the trees, which the larger plant size, will have like more vegetation rate. And we also find other striking results. We find there are plants that are very favored by the pollinators. Some are visited for nectar, and some are visited for pollen. For example, the tilia, the lindens, the hydrangea, the ilex, the langostrum, the clasera, they are very popular among the pollinators. And the videos is the clasera visited by a bee. And also, there are plants that are ignored by the pollinators, which are not very frequently visited, or just not visited by the pollinators. For example, the euonymus, the lilacs, and the shadbush. And this video shows a plant called the Tetradium, which is also called the bee trees. During the field work, we find hundreds of bees visiting these plants and collecting for nectar and pollens. And next is for Matteo.
Hello, everyone. This first slide that I'm presenting here, I think gives a good summary of our observations of woody genera in 2025. So what we have here is a bar chart. On the y-axis, we have woody genera, specifically genera for which we observed at least 3 plant species and for which we observed at least 1 pollinator per observation on average. And on the x-axis, we have the relative proportions of various pollinator types that we observed on these genera. I'd first like to draw your attention to the top row, which is the total row. And this depicts the relative abundance of each pollinator type across all of these genera, with the key takeaway being that bumblebees were our most frequently observed pollinator. Another key takeaway from this figure is that for each pollinator type, there are certain genera for which they predominate. So for example, honeybees, which are depicted in red, were clearly dominant on the genus Ilex, which is the hollies, and the genus Ligustrum, which is the privets. Bumblebees, which are in orange, were very dominant on the genus Rosa and the genus Hydrangea. Other native bees, which are in green, were dominant on the hawthorns and the sumacs. Carpenter bees, as previously mentioned, were very common on the genus Wisteria. And then other pollinators, which is primarily flies, were dominant on the genus Clematis. So then my portion of the project specifically focused on the woody plant preferences of bumblebees and honeybees and the degree to which they overlap. So what I have shown here is a mean pairwise phylogenetic distance analysis, which is sort of a complicated analysis, but essentially what it's doing is comparing the communities of plants that are visited by honeybees and by bumblebees and seeing how distant they are or how little overlap there is. And so the findings here, in 2024, our observed mean pairwise distance did not differ from a null mean pairwise distance, which essentially means that the amount of overlap in visitation between honeybees and bumblebees was similar to the amount of overlap that you would expect between 2 randomly assembled plant communities. And in 2025, the observed mean pairwise distance was actually significantly greater than a null mean pairwise distance, indicating less overlap between honeybee-visited plants and bumblebee-visited plants than would be expected between 2 random plant communities. So the key takeaway here is that there really is no evidence of overlap in woody plant visitation between bumblebees and honeybees. Similarly, we saw little to no linear relationship between the honeybee abundance on a given woody species and the bumblebee abundance on that same species. So here we have a scatter plot. On the x-axis, we have the log average honeybee abundance on a given woody species, and then the y-axis is the bumblebee abundance on a woody species. And the takeaway here is that there really doesn't seem to be much relationship between the two. We had a very slightly significant positive relationship in 2024, but it had a very low R-squared value. And then in 2025, we had no significant relationship. And yeah, the key takeaway here is just that honeybee abundance is not really a great predictor of bumblebee abundance on a given woody species. I'd like to point out a few species that were very popular for one or the other. So for example, if you look in the bottom right of this figure, the species Fleugia safruticosa was a very popular species among honeybees, particularly in 2024. But as you can see, the bumblebee abundance on that species is pretty low. Similarly, there are species that are very popular among bumblebees, but not so much among honeybees. For example, in the top left of this figure, Machia amurensis. And then there are also species that are very popular among both. For example, Tilia japonica and Colereteria paniculata. So while we did not see significant overlap in woody plant visitation between honeybees and bumblebees, what we did notice is that among genera visited by both honeybees and bumblebees, they tended to be foraging for the same resource. So here we have a scatter plot where on the x-axis we have a honeybee resource score, which is on a scale from 1.0, which is purely nectar collection, to 3.0, which is purely pollen collection, and 2.0 is like an even split of the two. And then on the y-axis, we have the same score, but for bumblebees. And we have a clear, strong positive correlation between the two scores, indicating that, for example, if honeybees are visiting a certain genus for pollen primarily, it's very likely that bumblebees are also doing the same thing. There were some genera that were clearly very popular for one resource or the other. For example, Castanea, Rosa, and Spirea were all very popular for pollen among both bumblebees and honeybees. And then for nectar, Berberis, Caragana, and Ligustrum. One other question that we address in our research is, how do we know if the insects at the Arnold Arboretum have been changing over time? And one way we're able to address this question is with data from Otto Plath, who was an entomologist and BU professor who studied 13 species of bumblebees at the Arnold Arboretum while he was writing his 1934 book called Bumblebees and Their Ways. He recorded them visiting 39 different plant taxa. So there are two striking differences between what Plath observed and what we observed, with the first being the difference in the number of bumblebee species. So Plath observed 13 species of bumblebees, and we are only observing 4, and really only 3 very commonly. One of them has been quite rare. The other striking difference is the number of taxa being visited by the bumblebees, with Plath only recording 39, while we have observed several hundred plant taxa being visited by bumblebees. It's worth noting that this second pattern is likely attributable to the fact that Plath wasn't super focused on bumblebee foraging and was rather focused on social behavior. There's also the fact that there's a lot more plants today than there were in his day, but still an interesting pattern nonetheless. Also a little fun fact, he was the father of novelist Sylvia Plath, who wrote the famous novel The Bell Jar. And with that, I will turn it over to Ethan.
So Sylvia Plath herself was actually born right across the street from the Arnold Arboretum in 1932. Born just on Prince Street, a little bit north of the Honeywell building. And she herself also kept bees. And so looking at her poetry in which she collected her experiences and observations, a lot of her historical observations she noted we saw true today, such that she noted that the golden rain tree dripped its powders down in the little boudoirs streaked with orange and red. Similarly, we saw solitary bees really having a preference for that golden rain tree. She also noted how high up the bees were going to collect their flora resources, and denoting many different plants that we noted, including hawthorn, rose, prunus, all of which she noted observation, so did we. Looking at more of the phylogenetic aspects of our research, we saw there's a very strong phylogenetic effect of what plants honeybees want to visit. So we have here a phylogenetic tree of all the plants that honeybees were visiting. in 2025. So a phylogenetic tree here, we have all of the most closely related species are clustered together, with each little branch noting evolutionary change over time. And we can see it's overlaid with the color denoting honeybee visitation. So where red shows little to no visitation around 0, going to yellow colored, representing anywhere from 1 to 10 visits per observation, all the way up to the greens and blues, noting nearly over 100 visits per observation. And there's clear preferences, where we see Prunus and Rosa getting nearly 0 visits from honeybees, and other more closely related species like holly, hydrangea, honeysuckles, and most notably Tilia and Chlorotera up there by the bright blue in the top left, receiving very high visitation rates. And because we can see these are clustered among closely related species, we can say that these are phylogenetically conserved, that more closely related species demonstrate the same visitation rates, similar visitation rates, more similar than that if they were not related. The same sort of pattern phylogenetically can be observed in what resource honeybees are collecting from each plant, where we have here red denoting almost exclusively pollen collection, blues representing almost exclusively nectar collection from a given plant species, and green denoting that we observed both pollen and nectar collection happening on the species. And again, we see that conservation where roses and spirea clustered together, having more pollen visitation, and towards the bottom you've got things like Linicera and Ilex hollies and such that are almost exclusively collected for nectar. And this makes sense. The closely related plants have more similarly attractive characteristics to honeybees than they would otherwise. Phylogeny also impacts the rest of our data. So even when we account for phylogeny in our day of the year calculations, we can see there's still a strong phylogenetic effect for plant species. This graph shows the day of year and the likelihood of finding a honeybee on a given plant. So for any given plant, there was about a 10% chance in April that you would find a honeybee on that plant. And then as we got closer to July, 50 to 60% chance of finding a honeybee on a given plant. So that means that our more spring flowering species like Prunus and Malus received less visitation than those in Tilia and Castanea. The last thing we saw here is that there is changes across our survey years, where comparing 2024-2025, different genera experience higher and lower visitation rates over time, with certain species increasing 60 to 50% of visitation rates, while others drop down by 80%, and a few receiving very little visitation. This is among those that were observed in both years. And the differences here can be attributed mainly to differences in weather and flowering intensity. When Pyrus and Prunus flowered this year, it was rainy, it was cloudy. It was not as successful weather patterns as it was in 2024. It's also possible that having successful flowering year in 2024 meant that plants invested less resources in their flowering intensity a future year. So we see changes, but it's likely due to usual variation. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Richard.
So what are the next steps in this research? So we've described to you why we did the research and our methods and some of the results, and where do we go from here? So one next step is to do a third year of work, because we've seen that there are quite strong differences between years, and so getting a third year would allow us to perhaps see whether there's any kind of additional patterns, whether there's some consistency. Another important next step is to try to distinguish the insect species in greater detail. So we really are going to try to recruit an entomologist to work with us, and by having an entomologist particularly help us to identify the native bee species, that will really add another dimension to the study. Another next step is to combine our research at the Arnold Arboretum with what people are observing at other botanical gardens around the world. So this is part of a network of 12 botanical gardens. And at some botanical gardens, it's very clear that they're seeing very different kinds of insects visiting their plants. So more species of apis, for example, a greater abundance of flies at other gardens. And so by comparing our results here at the Arnold Arboretum with results from around the world, we'll get a better appreciation of the nuances of these communities. And then another possibility, which is a very ambitious idea, is to see if we can potentially find out where there are concentrations of honeybees in the Jamaica Plain area and convince those honeybee keepers to potentially close their honeybee hives for a period of 1 or 2 days. So you can just imagine an experiment where we have a big crew out on day 1 and we very intensively survey the flower visitors. And then on day 2, we get the beekeepers, potentially at places like Forest Hills or other places nearby where there are a concentration of honeybees. We get them to close their hives on day 2 in the morning. And then we go out and we observe the grounds of the Arnold Arboretum to see whether there's a big decrease in honeybee visitation and whether potentially the native pollinators are shifting the plants that they're visiting. And then on day 3, the hives are opened again, the honeybee hives are opened again, and we can see whether the honeybees come back to the Arboretum and whether that causes a shift in the behavior of the native pollinators. So this is a kind of an experiment that we're thinking about doing. It requires a lot of thought and logistics and cooperation, but it's something that we are thinking about trying. So what are the conclusions? So one of the things that we're seeing, certainly just summing up all the research that has been talked about in the results, is that there are certainly honeybees and native pollinators on the grounds. They seem to be coexisting. So there are strong preferences of honeybees and native bees for different plants. But on a lot of plants, they seem to be coexisting. So there seem to be enough resources for all the groups at the Arnold Arboretum. We still don't know if we removed all the honeybees, would the native bees increase in abundance? We don't know that. But at least to some level, they're coexisting right now. We also find that each pollinator group has strong preferences, that honeybees, bumblebees, carpenter bees, et cetera, each group has certain preferences for certain plant species. There are very strong ecological effects and environmental effects, so there are certain preferences for trees, shrubs, and herbs. Also, there are these environmental factors, especially the flower abundance and the seasonality very strongly affect visitation rates. So we can see these patterns, and also very strong evolutionary patterns that insect species are tending to visit plant groups by genera and families, so there's kind of an evolutionary relationships. And kind of a final point, which is really important here, is that if one is thinking about things to do to promote native insects, one thing which you certainly want to do is to encourage the planting of trees, because trees have the most flowers, especially trees that are flowering in the late spring or summer, because that's when there are often a lot of insects and not as many floral resources. And also you want to make sure that those trees or shrubs or whatever plants you're growing have abundant flowers, because the more flowers there are on the plant, the more insects that will be there. So there's no point in planting plants and then not taking care of them, and they don't flower because insects won't visit them. Another very important part of this study is the fact that we also really prioritized public outreach in this study and making people aware of what we're studying and emphasizing our results. So at the end of the summer, we sent out a press release to the Boston University press office and told them what we were doing, and they sent a reporter out to the Arboretum. And they wound up doing a feature article featuring Matteo and everyone else in the group. But they had this big article in the BU Online magazine showing Matteo with videos and photographs. And so that meant that the whole large Boston University community and also people who read the BU magazines would know about our work. And we also presented these results at various symposia at Boston University, especially undergraduate research symposium. So again, people would know about what we're doing. And I think that this is something which is very important for scientists, is to have a wide outreach so that the public is aware of these ecological issues, these climate change issues, these conservation issues, and these crises facing insects in our community. And with that, I stop. And again, I want to thank, I guess we're stopping, so we will stop. And again, just thank the Arnold Arboretum for the support this year and the continuing support for our research. And also thank Boston University and Brandeis University for the funding which we've received. Thank you very much. And we're happy to take questions now. So I think we should all come up here now, and we can be addressing questions from the audience and from and by people who are online. Just want to also mention the fact that this is a summary of what we're doing. We could talk for actually hours. There's a lot of things that we didn't have a chance to talk about here. Yes.
This is a great presentation. Thank you for sharing that. I'm a horticulturalist on the ground, so I'm not surprised to see the lilacs are not a busy pollinator reservoir. But I was curious, what is the biggest driver for native insects? Is it the source of food, whether it's pollen or nectar, or the origin of the plant, whether it's a native plant or an introduced species, or is that even a factor for?
Okay. So, anybody want to talk about whether it's a native or not native plant? Did you investigate that at all?
I did.
Okay, go ahead.
So we did not see any major effects, whether it's a native plant versus a non-native plant among our main taxonomic groups. It seemed that really what mattered most was how strong it was flowering, and if a certain plant was better for nectar or for pollen, just by happenstance, they would collect that resource from it. There didn't seem like, just because it's a native plant, that it was the most attractive.
I mean, just sort of adding to that, the fact that, like, for example, if you look at tilias, I mean, there's native tilias and non-native tilias, and the insects actually don't know. They don't know where they're from. So they're visiting all the plants equally from a certain genus. Yes?
I'm curious about the seasonal patterns that you showed in terms of the floral abundance, right? Like there's definitely moments with scarcity and moments of a lot of flowering. And I wonder if you have any plant species that actually has a very long flowering season that you could kind of study in the sense to see as a control what's the actual dynamics of competition. Maybe one that is visited by both bumblebees and honeybees, and how that would look like in time when the floral resources are changing.
Does anybody want to talk about any plants that flower for a long time?
Seems like a you question.
Well, I think that the plants, I mean, the plant species that flower in the spring mostly flower in this kind of burst. So we have this big burst of flowering in the spring, and then they finish. And I think that during the summer, you have things that flower for a much longer time. So, I mean, certainly, I mean, one thinks of maybe like hypericums really flower for a really long time, some of the shrubby hypericums, or kind of in the fields, like the milkweeds flower for a really long time. So I think that you can have this longer flowering in the summer, but it's really the kind of short burst. I mean, maybe we could ask some of the horticultural staff. So what are the longest flowering plants in the collection? Any suggestions? The longest flowering plants?
The roses do flower pretty frequently, and especially the ones that get deadheaded. Now those maybe don't get visited as frequently, but those will go months at a time.
That's right. So, maybe, right, so maybe the roses flower over a really long time, and that's, certainly a species which bumblebees especially really visit that very actively to collect pollen. Any other?
Colwitteria, the individual trees have a pretty nice flowering time, but the different specimens we have some really early ones and we have some really late ones. I'm thinking you probably have almost 2 months where Colwitteria is in flower, so that might be an excellent one, even though it won't be individually looking at, but you'll be looking at the early ones, the late ones, the middle ones.
Actually, I think, I'm not sure if it was this year or last year, but there was actually, I think it was maybe 2 years ago, the Colwitteria, one of the Colwitterias in the shrub and vine garden, it flowered for a really long time, it stopped flowering, and then it flowered again. So it kind of, went through this kind of cycle. Yes?
So what happened to the bumblebees? So
Wait.
12 to 4, 3 of which are common. Do you think they're extirpated in Boston, the other 8 species? Or if you look at iNaturals, do you find they're just not here?
Right, well, I think that these bumblebees, anybody else want to take that? Do you want to talk about bumblebees?
I would just say that when you look at your INAT data, the 4 species are the ones that you find. You're not finding more than the 4 in the greater Boston area. we only saw it 2 days,
2 times.
and, what was that?
Just 2 observations, I think.
Yeah, and then on Ina, there's some over at the zoo maybe, like there's a handful of perplexing around, but they're not here.
Right, so I think this bumblebee decline is really a general phenomenon throughout kind of the region. I think as you go more to rural areas, they tend to have a few more species of bumblebees, but there has been this massive decline of bumblebee species. Yes?
I guess my question, generally, like, the bumblebees that you're studying, I'm assuming they're mostly generalists, and are there other insects that you were looking at that are more specialists, and were you seeing any specialist ones going to things beyond what their specialty is? How does that interplay with your research, I guess?
So anybody else someone want to talk about carpenter bees or what they're doing or anything else? Want to talk about carpenter bees?
Sure. Yeah, so there were certain bees, like carpenter bees, have a pretty strong preference towards things like wisteria, those sort of vining plants. But even though we saw them not necessarily specialized, but really strongly prefer a certain group, they were occasionally going to, we would see the rogue carpenter bee on an ilex just around. So even if they have a strong preference towards one, it really was what was available during the season or during that day.
And so, I mean, there's this kind of phenomenon with a lot of flower visitors that they visit their favorite plant, but they're always checking out other plants to see whether they're better. So they're often kind of moving around. Kind of one really interesting insect to see there is the giant sculpted resin bee. That's a really fascinating bee. You just, right in the middle of the summer, suddenly there's this huge bee that looks really different from other bees. It has a more elongated body and more brown, and its wings are a little bit different shape. And that just has this really strong preference for the golden rain tree and a few others, and the BB tree. So it has a very short season and a very definite preference. One of the most fascinating bees on the grounds is the wool carder bee, which is a European bee introduced to the United States. And that has this really strong preference for members of the mint family. So you just see these wool carder bees establishing territories around members of the mint family, especially in the shrub and vine garden. And they just defend this, and it's really very, very specialized behavior. Yes?
Can you talk about how, so you filled a gap in the literature focusing on the woody plants instead of the herbaceous plants. So are there any general lessons about how the woody plants are promoting, say, pollinator biodiversity in a way that the previous studies in the herbaceous plants suggest that they're not?
Okay, so Matteo?
Yeah, I guess I have one. I will say that there is some evidence that planting certain woody plants could be beneficial to insect biodiversity because we've found that there are certain woody genera for which, as I presented on before, like certain pollinator taxa prefer and others don't. So if we can plant certain woody genera that only one group prefers, we can reduce competition, and reducing competition would likely benefit insect biodiversity.
Again, when we talk to people at other botanical gardens about doing this work, at a number of other botanical gardens, they say, like, how can you study the trees? Because at many botanical gardens, they don't plant trees widely spaced. And so the trees, they can't see the flowers because the flowers are at the tops of the trees and they're on the ground, and there's all these intervening layers of leaves. And also the trees aren't often not flowering very well, so they can't. The great advantage of the Arnold Arboretum is you can study trees here, and you can't do that at a lot of other gardens. Yes?
I was just wondering about the relationship between like understory and trees, and is there any research on, herbaceous plants that attract certain pollinators and trees in a way to kind of combine them in the environment?
Sounds like your question, Colleen.
It does? I am not aware of literature that actually marries those two thoughts. I think one of the things that we were a little bit curious about was, is there even when we're looking at the trees as a whole, this isn't your question, but I'm going to just answer my own question, but when we're looking at trees as a whole, is there a difference in who's pollinating the bottom part of the tree versus higher up in the tree? And, I would say, like, while Richard, I agree, we can study the trees at the Arboretum in ways different than we could at other locations, there still has to be some bias in what we were detecting in terms of those smaller pollinators and not being able to detect them at the tops of the trees, right? So for the most part, in those 5-minute windows, unless nothing was happening at eye level, we would scan up. But like, if there was a lot happening at this level, we might not necessarily have scanned up. But it would be interesting to see how what's below it influences that proximity. Because the other thing about the Arboretum is everything's organized by taxa together. So is there a bias that things are just already there visiting that group? And so whereas if we were at a different garden where the collections were dispersed, would we see those same patterns of preference?
Yes? Oh.
One small one. Did you test any overlap in between the feeding trees and the hosting trees? Did you track like where does the insect tend to host?
What do you mean by a hosting tree?
Nesting or like paralleling?
Right, so we haven't really done any behavior regarding kind of where they're nesting, so we don't really know too much about that. So maybe that's something that an entomologist could be doing to find out where these bumblebees and solitary bees are nesting. We think the carpenter bees are nesting in the bandstand in the shrub and vine garden. Can we call it the bandstand? The bandstand in the shrub. We think that maybe they're nesting there, but we're not sure. I'm not sure if you know.
No, I don't, we had.
They're definitely nesting. I mean,
They're
they're definitely
there.
nesting in the bandstand. And so does that bias the wisteria, so, yeah.
One more question. Yes.
In the Magnoliaceae, Liriodendron tulipifera, the tulip tree, I guess it's Coleoptera, the ones that are pollinating. I'm asking also because there are, I think there are just 2 species of Liriodendron in the world. One is here and the other is in Asia, something like that. And since you have these, parallel studies on the other side, like what is happening on the other side with these trees? I don't know if they flower like for 5 days. I don't know. I've been trying to catch them like around June, at the beginning of June, and then they disappear. It's very fast, the flowering. I don't know if you catch them.
I mean, there's certain expectations of what you see for the pollinators, and I mean, I really hadn't thought about them as being beetle pollinated, but maybe they are. But when we looked at the flowers, we didn't see any beetles on them. But we were more looking for insects flying. Maybe next year we should look more for the beetles on them. The only one species where we saw a lot of beetles was on the swamp mallow, Hibiscus moschatus. So on that species growing around near the pond, if you look in the flowers, there's just huge numbers of these tiny little mordelid beetles. So huge numbers of beetles in those. That's the only plant I think we saw that had very many beetles. But we should be looking more, and we should have an entomologist.
We need to double the size of the team. Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming over here. To the 3 students, fantastic presentations. To the 2 professors, really great presentations. But they've had more practice. But what a delight to see our collections being studied in interesting and novel ways. So again, another round of applause and pizza upstairs. You know, Larry Denver is just covered in nectar on the sides.
I do, and he might also.
So I